Words have power, and typography is their voice. Interesting. Um, are some fonts more believable than others? So this is the concept of what feeling do different fonts give you, and choosing that feeling of font to go along with certain propaganda that you are working on in your visual communication. So, and I'll show you a lot of examples of that throughout this process. So, Baskerville. Does that seem the most believable if it was people and you had to believe one of them? Possibly. And why is that? So here's some of the science of why certain ones give you kind of a little bit more formal and educated because visually we've seen it in certain ways, whereas some others are more fun and playful. So you're going to hear the word serif and you're going to hear the word sans serif. So the difference is serif means they have little feet typically. It's little extras. Whereas sans serif, meaning no feet, has none. There's no extra little kick out on this guy. Body copy, large amounts of text. It's typically easier to read sans serif, meaning no feet, on a screen. But in contrast, it's easier to read serif, meaning they have a foot, on a printed paper. So that goes back to lessons prior where it's like, where is this going to come out as? How is this piece going to be presented to the world? Is it going to be a printed poster or is it going to be on a website? So think about that. So typically screens, easier for sans serif, and paper is serif. Now, you have to walk that imaginary line of making sure that your brand is still represented properly, whether it's print or digital. So you don't want to have two totally different looks, even though they both call for slightly different things. Leading is the vertical line space in between lines of type. So tight leading, very spaced out leading. I always say for the alliteration, line height, leading, line height. So the height of each line helps me remember that. So you got to remember the word leading. Tracking is the horizontal space between the words. So I think of a train track, and I think of how this train track is much tighter, and this train track is much more spread out. Kerning, that's in between single letters. So that's the tracking, but only a single letter, not a big line of text. And that's typically when you are going in and really meticulously perfecting design to work perfectly, is when you're getting into the kerning of things. So alignment, we've got left aligned. I think we all know that. We've got right aligned. I think we all know that too. We've got justified. I'm not a huge fan of justified. I think justified creates some weird visuals that I'm not a huge fan of. And then this centered over here. Here's centered. Body copy, typically we don't use a lot of centered, especially in something this big. Okay, anatomy of the type. So when you break down type, there's quite a few things you want to understand about it. You've got descenders and ascenders. So those are the the upwards or the downward of things. So this piece of type, this typography, has a much bigger ascender than descender. It's got a really short, stumpy descenders. It also has a baseline. That's where all the letters end at. Crossbars, so that's where these lines like this X and the A hit. Your X height, so that's your like the height of most of your lowercase letters. Your cap height, meaning when it's capitalized, what's the height of those? And then after that, it's your ascenders. How much bigger are those? So these are good to know. The ascender, the cap height, the X height is kind of your average of your lowercase. Crossbars, so, think about that A. Baseline is just the bottom, and descenders are for letters like P and J. So this kind of talks about them a little bit, a stroke. The ascender, the bar. Remember, this is a serif, meaning a foot. A sans serif would not have a foot, but this one's a serif. The counter, the descender is this guy over here. The counter is this like inside part. X height, kind of the height of your lowercase letters, creates an impression of the font's size. So you can see this one has a shorter X height. For some reason it looks shorter, even though they're both the same font size. Whereas this font, Arial, has a taller X height and it makes the font look bigger. You also hear every once in a while of one story versus two story. Really think of it as kind of the more like old school typewriters being the two story for certain letters versus the standard one story. Type is measured in point size, so you'll hear, like we said before, 8 to 12 point font is pretty standard for body copy, although 8 is really tiny and we wouldn't use that for an AARP ad. So there are 72 points per inch. This kind of breaks it down. Here's an inch, here's all those points. And then every once in a while you'll hear picas, and there's 12 points per pica. I work in pixels actually, and inches typically, but it's always good to understand these. Okay, so now we're just going to kind of look at a lot of different fonts. You'll see these Gothic fonts. I mean, these are very stylized. You would only utilize them with very specific clients. Old style, kind of similar, and this is a serif. Remember, it's got a foot. And everyone remember what like this little line would represent, X line. So here's this kind of old school with the serif. You've got transitional, which is sort of that old school serif, but like modernized. So you'll see like a little sharper edges on things, which is kind of cool. Here's a little bit of showing each of those, like the old school versus the transitional version. They're this is so minuscule and very niche, but just know that that's there. You can see that Mercedes-Benz is more traditional because they've got this kind of sans serif old school, but it's a little more modernized with some of its sharper edges. Here's a very modern serif where, I mean, it's just sharp and graphic. Very interesting. Here's all three of those next to each other now. You can see how very, very similar they are. How Gap is definitely using, I mean, a little bit of the modern serif. Slab serif, you could also kind of think of that as bold serif, and those have their place also, like the logo of Honda. And again, here's all four of those now next to each other and how different they can be. Then we get into sans serif. So no feet. No feet. How different that looks compared to these. Whew, very different. But it works for some logos. So here's Chevrolet. They've done it. Huge Fortune 500 company, and that works. Scripted. And what can scripted do for you? If you're a company like Cadillac and you want everything to feel very elegant and rich, having that very old school scripted look can work. Now be careful with scripted. As with any kind of style, it needs to be done properly. Don't make everything scripted. These are called display or decorative, spelled wrong, fonts. I also call them stylized. And these are like one and done. You're not going to use multiples of something that's this crazy inside any piece. So here's an example of it done really well, very bolded, but interesting, and it's only done once. It's not like then they used a whole different font for other things. Here's a bunch of examples of them. Just notice how kind of crazy and all over the place they are. Again, you're using one and done. You're not going to use a bunch of those. You're going to use that very sparingly. Just more of that and how kind of crazy those are. Okay, readability. Can you read it? How easy is it to read? Legibility, how easy one can recognize the letters. So not only reading it, but just single word and letter legibility. And that gets crazy. Like you go back and look at some of these and it's like, I don't know what letter that is. Like, I don't know, that one may be hard. Is that a D? I have no idea. How easy is the text to read versus how easy is the text to read. So you're never going to use and what do we refer to it as? You're never going to use a display type, let me get back to that, for body copy. Body copy needs to have legibility, and where I'm not saying it needs to be the most boring type that's ever existed, but it should not be some crazy type that you cannot even read. How easy can one recognize letters? That's very challenging. I cannot. I mean, it says lorem ipsum, and it's foreign words. It's Latin. But can you recognize most letters? Actually, I kind of can for most, but you'd still never do any of that for body copy. Versus, look at this serif with its little feet, and he's much easier to read. Typefaces, so fonts have their own personality. Does that look elegant? I don't know that that looks elegant. Does that look elegant? Yes, much more. A birthday party for Charlie that kind of looks like handwriting, which is fun. So I like this guy. Now, is this serious? I don't think of this as serious. I think of this as very playful. If the word said playful, it would go much more with that font. That's more serious. Kind of just bold and to the point. Wild West, I don't know. I don't think of Wild West as a very modern serif. I think of Wild West as very different. Now, this is a serif, but it just has a different feel. Gilligan's Island. That kind of works for me for Gilligan's Island. No, I guess kind of so does that. This seems more fun, though, to me. Grunge, I don't think of this as grungy at all. I do think of that as grungy. And I know that's quite literal. You know, that is a grungy font, but that's the vibe. You have to understand that every font has a vibe, and you need to be using the right vibes to communicate your information. That's just really important. Okay, so pairing fonts, so fun. Once you've learned a lot about a single font, putting them together can be really fun. So see, this Chromatech has two fonts, kind of a heavier, thicker one and a little bit thinner. I actually like this version, but here's a few more. Two different fonts, two different fonts. That's kind of cool. Okay, and so then here it shows two different fonts being used. The most simple way of thinking of it is like a thick font versus a thin font. Very, very simple. That's not the only way to think about it. It's just the basic way to think about it. Again, two different fonts, but done even better with two different fonts. Two different fonts, and that's cool. But when we do it more like this, because maybe that grunge goes with like the snowboarder aesthetic that people vibe with, so that would work for that extreme sport. Summer concert series. Ooh, we don't have a before after that one, but you know, multiple different fonts to draw you in and pairing them together, making sure they work. Don't pair 4 different fonts. Think 2, only 2. This one has 2. That's a little bit more with this italicized but close, but it's this nice bold, and then this thinner one that we can have good legibility with. It's all in caps, and that works for this, and it's left aligned. All kind of the same, or two different fonts, even a different background color. And look how much more elegant and designed this guy looks than this guy. So we've got this and that. And then when you compare them, now I think it's not totally fair because this one has some of the words like wine tasting and this one doesn't, which bugs me. Oh, it is in here. Okay, it's buried in it. Pulling out some of those major things like the, I don't even know how to pronounce that exactly, but the wine tasting in that, those are kind of the most important things. So using that as like a heavy, very contrasty font that draws you in, and then a thinner font that gives all the rest of your context. Cool. Even this has two fonts. It's a little crazy. Not a great example. Kind of a thick, kind of a thinner, sort of, but just typography and what typography can do in design. Beautiful typography. Very fun, thin, and then just simple. I think when all else fails, go very simple with your body copy. Across the board, even in your more advanced classes, it's just better. It looks better. Don't read into it so much of I need to use these crazy different fonts all the time. Sometimes, most of the time, with body copy, simple is best. What's your angle? Such an interesting graphic. I just love it for Canon. What is your angle? And then these thin little moments. Wild combination, the contrast of the black and the white, and then this sky blue, this fat font, and then this thin, squished in font. The contrast of color. I just love both eyes are utilizing this dot, which is such an interesting concept of repetition. Contrast with the background. The alignment is beautifully done in those little moments. The proximity of things is good, but not too squished. It's just nice. Heed my warning about red and black because those are hard to use and very difficult to read. Now, it works enough. A little difficult to read. If it was a little bit bigger, it might be even easier to read. I do, though, love the contrast of her on this background. For the contrast, the repetition of this red and this red, the alignment of this moment sitting in between the ascender of this D and this capped M. And the proximity of it where it's tight but not too tight. It could have the tiniest bit more air in there and that'd be okay. Just very interesting. A lot of heavy text. I don't know that two different texts are used too much here, but the coloring is. So this light blue versus this white. This is very interesting in terms of typography. I'm just like kind of obsessed with the little hands down here and how you really are like hierarchy-wise, you're at him and then the illusionist and then these hands. And like I want to read all in here in case it gives me more information of these like these funny little hands. So a lot of contrast with the black onto the like light yellow. Even the kind of deep magenta, has a lot of shade in it. So it's dark, almost like a black. And the repetition of that color here and here and here. The proximity and alignment of like this word tucked up into here. Beautiful. So much going on, but so pretty for student exhibition. I think without having a lot of full letters, the legibility of that text is so amazing, and we know what it says without having to see a full word, which is really cool. I mean, they don't even have a B here, and I think all of us see this as B. Again, two different like font colors are being used, like a lighter version and the darker, lighter, darker, lighter, darker. And then just the contrast of the text on the background, the repetition of the colors, the alignment of everything really amazingly. And then the proximity of everything, not too close. There's nice little moments of padding. And then there's so much going on here that they've left all this nice breathing room out here. Very, very similar. This is cool in terms of like kind of knowing what it says without having to see a perfect word on there. And the little tucked in moments is so cute. And then again, this is the final slide of just like multiple fonts. This gets a lot. There's a lot of fonts going on, if you ask me. A lot of color variation. I'm not a huge fan, but just another example. All right, let me know if you have any questions.